Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, and he's the founder of the Islamic American Forum for Democracy. And so, one of the interesting points that people miss is how Islamism, the political Islam, is different from, say, normal Islam, and also how these, say, new tyrannical systems that we see in a lot of the Arab world are rooted in socialism. And so, tell us kind of how this works. I mean, for a lot of people, they think, oh, isn't Islam also theocratic by nature? How does socialism tie to it? And of course, it's interpreted in different forms in different countries, which, I mean, honestly, even for me, reading some of the stuff, I still don't fully wrap my head around. But I know you're an expert on this and also a Muslim yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, I look at it through an American lens, and I think you have to have a historical, not an ahistorical approach to Islam. And Islam is in its history right now, where the West was in its history in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, in which they were fighting against theocracy. And the groundwork for that battle that became the American Revolution was an enlightenment, was a defeat of tribalism and a defeat of theocrats. So right now the theocrats in the Muslim world are two types. You've got the corporate theocrats, like the Saudi royal family, the monarchs, the El-Sisis, the military generals of the Middle East. And then you've got the viral theocrats, which are in some ways more dangerous because they have global hegemonic desires. And the viral theocrats are Islamists that when they get into power like the Brotherhood did in Egypt, like the Khomeinists on the Shia side did in Iran, they want to put into place, their constitution is not just a man-made one, they think it should be God's Quran as the constitution, and the law should be the Sharia law, that's Islamic law. But they don't view that as man-made interpretations, they view that as God's law that everyone needs to follow, that rights don't come from God, they come from Islam. So I look at it like, if you look at Colombia and global cocaine and drug use, you've got the distributors, which are the corporate drug users. They don't use the drug, but they distribute it. And then you have the gangs on the street that use it and sell it and make the economy flourish for the drug lords of the world. That's the same concept. Instead of cocaine, you replace that with political Islam, which is an opium of religious sort of theocracy where you mix national identity with Islamic practice and theocracy. That becomes basically the formula for 56 Muslim majority countries. So the only place you're really going to find a palpable non-Islamist Muslims that you can talk to is in the West, because in Islamic countries they're either in jail, tortured, or too afraid to speak up. Now even in the West they're afraid to speak up often because of the left's oppression.
I know you've been attacked.
Yeah, I'm called an Islamophobe even though my parents helped build 4 mosques in America. I love my faith. I'm pretty orthodox from a family values perspective. So I believe in prayer and fasting and teach my kids Quran. I went to Quran education. So, to them though, if you don't toe the line of Islamic collectivism and tribalism and wave the flag that your primary loyalty is to an Islamic collectivism, then you're an apostate. Then you reject their movement, their Islamic movement.
And I know we've spoken before on the idea of what it means when practice of religion no longer comes from a person's heart, when it's something forced on them and it's not legitimate. I mean, what's your perspective on this? Because I know you kind of stand against the idea of forcing religion on people.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
It's amazing to me that the radicals, the Islamists, the theocrats are never held up to a reasoned argument. Our Muslim Liberty Project at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy teaches youth that if you believe in a judgment day and that God is going to evaluate how we did as his creation, and he gave us free will. So if you have free will and judgment day means something, then God needs to know that you live in a laboratory of freedom so that he knows you had a choice. Because if you're a robot and you get forced or coerced into certain practices, judgment day means nothing. So if you really believe in God and free will, then it's even interesting. The theocrats, even the king of Saudi Arabia and their Wahhabis will say, oh, we don't force people to pray because that's their choice. Well, if you believe in that, why force them Why force away their free speech? Why force away the women's rights to property and their right to choose whether to wear the hijab or to be leaders in communities? All these things are simply power struggles, power takes, power grabs, rather than actually theological arguments, because the theological argument in Islam is very similar to Judaism. We don't have clergy. Imam means teacher, just like rabbi means teacher. So if you simply get input of advice, and at the end of the day, it's between you and God, not government, because the Islamists, they want to make government into God. And if, yes, God has many things that are pretty clear in the Quran, that you'll go to hell if you don't believe in him, etc. But the difference is, I, as a liberal Muslim, liberty-believing Muslim, believe that those punishments will not happen here. They'll happen in the hereafter. If I'm an atheist, God forbid, I'll pay for it in the hereafter, not on this earth. So if the greatest sin, which is rejecting God, is punished in the hereafter, all other sins that are victimless should not have anything to do with government. And that's why our mission is not to counter terrorism, which is the symptom, but to counter the establishment of religion through the Islamic establishment clerics.
And I know one important point you've mentioned before is how a lot of these modern systems are rooted in socialism. Could you explain to us how this happened?
Well, again, it should, to any student of tribalism and collective history, if you look at Eric Hoffer's book, for example, on True Believer, he said the main thing that attracts people to a movement and makes it successful is wanting to die for it. Well, the jihadists have created a movement that they want to die for, which is a collective concept that somehow, if one Muslim has a grievance in Palestinian areas, then I somehow, as an American, should somehow care about that. Sure, I care about human rights, but not just because they're Muslim, but because they're human beings, be they Jewish, Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, whatever they might be. It's because they're human beings I care, not because of the so-called ummah. So socialism is an economic concept that believes that you don't have property rights to yourself, that ultimately people's poverty and their struggles with economic failure or success is somehow your failures are my failures, and therefore we must collectivize and confiscate everybody else's property in order to distribute it, which actually ends up being a complete failure and inhuman, as we see in Venezuela, as we see in every socialist country. So the socialists, in what I call a red-green axis, and others have called it that, where the red is the communist socialist and the green is the Islamist, globally have always worked together, because when you're collectivizers, what more powerful collectivization than you want the economic collectivizers who collectivize with the Islamists? And you'll find most Islamist demagogues are also socialists, because when they get control of the government, not only are they trying to push forth their religion, they want to control your property. Because if you look at most successful, for example, women's rights activists in Muslim countries, they're women's rights advocates that have their own businesses, do not depend on their husbands, their brothers, or their uncles for their production of income, and they're able to then interpret the Quran on their own. So tied, and this is why I've been so, if you look at every Arab majority country, Muslim majority, most of them in the Arab world, they have no free markets. The only product they can come up with is the one underground, not the one between their ears. And the one underground is petrol that the government confiscates from their people and prevents. There isn't a single product that anyone can name that's come out of a Middle Eastern country. Why? Because they're completely stifled by socialist ideas that is very synergistic with Islamism. I want to punctuate this discussion though with one thing, which is ultimately the far left, the socialists, once they get into power, once the Islamists get into power, realize that they made a deal with the devil. Not that the socialists aren't the devil either, but the Islamists more so. And you'll find many of them, like the Socialist Workers' Party of Europe, has a huge thing of a list on their website why they won't work with Islamists. Because they thought, oh, wait a minute, they really aren't for women's rights. They aren't for gay rights. They aren't pro-choice and all these other things that they think are part of far-left progressivism. They're far from being progressivist, and they ignore it while they're working in the red-green axis. And that red-green axis is not only seen country to country, but you see it at the UN, where they work together to condemn Israel, to condemn America, and to deviate the world's attention from really what it should be about human rights and freedom to gaslighting the West.
It's interesting too, when you're talking about it, kind of like liberal principles, but liberal in the true definition
Classical
of it,
liberalism.
which is classical liberalism, which is liberty.
Exactly. That's why our Muslim Youth Project looks at, Hayek's book on the road to serfdom. We look at Bastiat's The Law. We
Classical
read
liberals.
Classical liberalism. So this is where, my question is not what the Prophet Muhammad did in the 7th century, but if he were alive today, I believe just like we modernized computer and medical science, they'd modernize political science and say, you know what, classical liberalism is far more in line with where Muslim thought should be than any other idea.
I see. So what you're talking about is kind of challenging the idea of forcing, of trying to control a person's beliefs, a person's property, a person's decisions in life, right?
Yep.
And making it into something that people can choose for themselves. This concept of free will, which we talk about, is a religious concept, right?
Exactly.
And one that was at the heart of really the American system, right?
That's why, to me, I've given speeches frequently about Americanism versus Islamism. Now, when I was on the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom for 4 years, appointed by Senator McConnell, when I went to Egypt, we went to Saudi Arabia 3 times, Egypt a couple times, to Bahrain, the main thing I'd ask him is not about Americanism. I'd say, I asked the Brotherhood when we were there, what is your definition of Egyptianism? If you think it's Islam, you are minimizing and dehumanizing the 10% of your population that are Coptic Christians. You're minimizing the Baha'i. You're ignoring Muslims who reject your interpretation of Islam. So, these countries, as much as they were carved out of post-World War II colonialism, which was the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all that, they have these national identities now. They need to stick with them. But the national identity needs to become an ideology. And that's what America did. America is not a race, it's an idea. Europe is struggling with that now, where you have some hyper-nationalist tendencies that are swinging the other way because of Merkel's open borders, where she accepted 1 million immigrants and others, so the German identity is coming back. But that German identity has a bad history in the early 20th century. So how are they going to avoid that? They're going to have to figure out how to marry classical liberalism with a German identity. One of the Muslim scholars that I read frequently is Bassam Tibi, who wrote a book on Islamism, much older than me and much more experienced. And in that book, he said, you know what? He was going to retire in America because even though he was in Germany for 40 years as a German scholar from Syria, he said he never felt German because the country still hadn't determined its identity, ideological identity, while America does have that. We're struggling with the gaslighting from AOC and Ilhan Omar and others. But at the end of the day, this kind of construct where our founding fathers founded the country based on a social contract of constitutional identity needs to evolve in many of these countries. And we need to go on the offense. We can do this. America and the West are the best campaigners on the planet. Certainly Russian television, Al Jazeera are pushing their Islamist ideas down our throat. So why don't we start mobilizing, operationalizing ideas of liberty into these countries?
Yeah. I think this is just maybe a good point to end it on.
Yeah.
Is that, it's funny that a lot of people who identify with socialism do so because they actually believe in these principles, but they believe that it's socialism that represents them, I think falsely. A lot of them call themselves liberal, right? And they really do oftentimes believe in the ideas of the individual and freedom and individual rights and these things, but they don't understand that the system they're going with is actually opposed to these things. And they talk about religious tolerance and these kinds of things. Unfortunately, we do have the state where religions, I think, are being pitted against each other, on the right sometimes, which I think is unfortunate. But really, it is the socialists who are trying to attack religion. It is them who stand against the ideas of religious liberty and who believe in wiping out the freedom of how we believe and what we believe in, right? And so I think you're getting at an interesting point, that what you're representing are the true principles of liberty.
That's why people said Islam needs a Martin Luther. And I say, no. That's going to take centuries, where you have reinterpretation of Islamic theology, which is going to need a new Islamic legal school, which we haven't had in actually 8-9 centuries, which is a huge production. I can't do it. That needs people that have a degree in Sharia law. What Islam needs is a John Locke. Islam needs a James Madison. individuals that believe in, first and foremost, individual liberty under God. I mean, what brought my ideas to where they are is reading de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville's idea that democracy flourishes because of a society that's moral, that believes in God, that democracy or a republic cannot flourish as it does in America without a moral people, which is why in the Middle East, after Saddam was taken down, Iraq failed, because after Syria's failing. Assad hasn't been defeated, though I pray for his defeat. The bottom line, though, is that after he leaves, because he's been around for 2 generations, there aren't too many moral leaders left. Does that mean you keep a dictator in place? Absolutely not. That'll evolve. It needs to go through that process. Iran is definitely worse off now than it was under the Shah, but that 40 years of theocracy they've had under the Khomeinis have basically solidified the fact that no matter, once they have free elections, they will never vote a monarch back, and they'll never vote a Islamic theocracy back. So just like kids have to experience things to grow out of it and mature, societies have to do that. And the left believes in their sanctimonious, self-righteous way that somehow their interpretation of rights are not natural rights, but rather welfare rights. That somehow welfare rights become natural rights from God. And that is not only horrifically irrational, it doesn't make sense. A right should be something I should be able to claim at any moment. Healthcare, as much as I want my patients to get rights, it can't be called a right unless, yes, we should make sure people don't die without healthcare, absolutely. But if you say it's a right, then that means the ability to pay and the stratification of care and all that can never happen, which is really inhuman when it comes to property rights.
Great. Real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
Great. Everyone, remember to please like and subscribe. See you next time.